Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I am Kris. This is Kings and Generals, Lee attacks Manassas and Antietam, American Civil War documentary. I accidentally clicked that on this is my third attempt to start this video. It keeps glitching. So anyways, thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Those are free for me. If you'd like to throw some money at the channel, you do that through the thanks button, request a video, and your name sponsoring that video. Before we get started though, I want to show you guys a little something I got for Christmas from my nephew. It's called History Hoard, Fossil Hoard. Yeah, we're phasing. I broadcast from Mars, apparently. There you go. So when you open this up, you got a nice little, like a little thing for cleaning. Then you can see the nice little lock on it. What is it? Yeah, let's just phase out. That's what I love to do. There you go. It is an American Civil War Union 58 cal mini ball from 1861 to 1865. It's in the glass there. I didn't open it. You can. I don't want to. Get this little card in here. Come on. Come on. Let's phase out. There we go. It says Union Civil War Mini Ball, Virginia. These 3-ring. 1, 2, 3. Come on. These 3-ring 58 caliber mini ball bullets were typically used by Union forces during the American Civil War. They were discovered using metal detectors in Virginia on private land in various areas that were active during the Civil War. The mini ball was a game changer for modern warfare. Previously, musket balls were inaccurate, low-powered, and could take a full minute to load. Soldiers often just ended up using their bayonets instead. It's not exactly true. Not all soldiers use bayonet. I think they said it was like less than 800 total deaths from bayonet charges. So it was, anyways. However, the mini ball changed that. Suddenly, rifles were more accurate, more deadly, and much more practical. The main advantage of this new style of musket ball was that it allowed for rifles to be fully utilized during combat, an impossible feat just a few years earlier. The mini ball drastically shortened that time it took to reload by both fitting easily down the barrel of a rifle and eliminating the need for constant cleaning. They also exited the barrel at bone-shattering speeds and hit their mark with greater precision. For better or for worse, the new projectile had changed warfare forever. Certificate of Authenticity. This certificate attests that all relics contained herein have been found to be genuine, verified to the best of their ability of History Hoard's numismatic team. Numismatic team. Something like that. Just so you can kind of get a size reference. Here's some chapstick, right? You can kind of see. It's probably about an inch long. I mean, thumb. It's certainly not going to feel good if the thing, fires inside of you. So, you know what? I'll put this away after I start the video. So anyways, I thought that was pretty cool. This will come out after his gift arrives. The first gift got delayed and then sold out. But the second gift, in exchange for this, I got him a 1806 Napoleon flintlock pistol replica. Thought he might like that. So that arrives Tuesday, and then I have to mail it out to him. Okay, so this is there is an ad, so I might just make it one video. I don't know. We'll see how I feel.
Despite holding an overwhelming material and manpower advantage, George McClellan's delusional timidity let Robert E. Lee scare him away from Richmond. While McClellan cowered in Harrison's Landing, Lee began to look north. A new threat had emerged, but with it a new opportunity. Lee knew that the South couldn't win a long war, as its material deficiencies were already becoming a problem. Therefore, he began to contemplate an offensive to win the war outright. Welcome to our latest episode on the American Civil War, in which the South's boldest general will go on the offensive. This video is sponsored where a 64 officer attacked public and July refusing to move from Harrison's Landing. He insisted that Lee had at least 200,000 soldiers, but that he could retake the offensive and drive on Richmond again if all Union forces in the East and West were immediately sent to reinforce him. However, President Lincoln and the cabinet were thoroughly disenchanted with McClellan. Their intelligence said Lee hadn't fielded more than 90,000 soldiers during the Peninsular Campaign, and couldn't have more than 80,000 now. The only thing preventing McClellan's 100,000 troops from taking Richmond was their general's delusions. Therefore, Lincoln brought in Henry Halleck, a less talented but more realistic general from the Western Theater, to take over as general-in-chief. Recognizing that the units Jackson had humiliated during the Valley Campaign were aimlessly licking their wounds in Northern Virginia, and could make another drive on Richmond, Halleck and Lincoln tapped Major General John Pope to form a new army. Pope had won several victories in the Western Theater through audacity, and they hoped he would bring that spirit east. Pope's Republican ties and calls for a harder war against the Confederates didn't hurt either. What did hurt was Pope himself. He was a braggart and as diplomatic as a brick to the face. His corps commanders were all senior to him, which they found insulting, and his
Why is that Jeff Daniels from Gettysburg? Be right back. Okay. Okay, the mustache is not as thick. We can agree on that. But you're telling me that is not Jeff Daniels? You are lying to yourself and all of us. It's a shame we have to live in that world with you, because that's goddamn Jeff Daniels. I'm just picturing him say, "Fix bayonets, gentlemen." All right.
45,000 men were demoralized. Pope's response upon taking command was to deliver a grandiose speech, touting his achievements in the West, extolling the aggressive spirit of the Western armies, and that he expected to only ever see the backs of his enemies.
Why does Pope seem to be like he's about to start doing a Doctor Strange portal? It's goddamn Jeff Daniels again. Okay, I'm not even going to look it up. I'm going to look it up. This looks like one of the guys from Tom Hanks' movie The Burbs. I think it's from '88. What a... Be right back. Okay. This guy. Now the mustache isn't as big, but look at that. Come on. You're telling me? That's him. He's also in Children of the Corn. Courtney Gaines. Now I'm just scrolling through things that aren't important. There he is again. Beard isn't as bushy. That's him. I see what Kings and Generals is doing. I got it. I know what you're up to.
Instead of inspiring the army, Pope's bravado insulted everyone. Several subordinates resigned rather than serve with him. The new Army of Virginia never believed in its commander. On the other side, the Army of Northern Virginia was in poor condition despite high morale. The Confederacy couldn't keep its military supplied, much less reinforced. Lee's ammunition stocks were full, but only through looting Union supplies, and he struggled to replace the 20,000 casualties from the 7 days battles. The Confederacy's manpower had dried up, while men still flocked to Union recruiting stations. The Confederate Congress had adopted America's first conscription law in April, but enforcing it was proving difficult. He had about 80,000 men in his department, but garrisoning Richmond and other positions while protecting supply lines meant he only had about 55,000 available for action. Worse, while Union troops were regularly issued new uniforms, weapons, and shoes, his troops had to wait their turn each time increasingly rare shipments arrived from the few southern factories. Lee realized that he had to win the war quickly to avoid defeat. However, his army needed reorganization. He'd failed to land a decisive blow during the 7 days, primarily due to poor coordination, caused by decentralized command. Directly issuing orders to division commanders had led to confusion, overmanagement, and miscommunication. To solve this, the Army's 11 divisions were consolidated into 7. Stonewall Jackson and James Longstreet, his best officers, were made lieutenant generals to command each wing of the army, with J.E.B. Stuart commanding the cavalry. Lee also changed his command style. Rather than prepare specific battle plans, his lieutenants would be assigned objectives and a desired end state, and then given discretion to achieve their objectives. Lee couldn't deal with both McClellan and Pope should they unite their commands. However, Lee knew McClellan wasn't a threat and spotted an opportunity. Pope's orders were to move towards Gordonville and cut the Virginia Central Railroad, securing both Washington's flank and the Shenandoah Valley while making life as difficult for Confederate sympathizers as possible before linking up with McClellan. Pope was due significant reinforcements, but his advance would be isolated and therefore exposed. Lee planned to use this isolation to trap and destroy Pope, hoping to produce a Saratoga-esque victory and win the Confederacy European recognition. The first step was to protect the Virginia Central, a major lifeline for Richmond, and by extension the army. To this end, Jackson was sent to Gordonville with 14,000 troops, successfully thwarting efforts by Union cavalry to cut the line on July 19th and 22nd. On July 26th, paroled prisoners alerted him that increased Union naval traffic meant Pope's reinforcements were arriving. This convinced him to dispatch A.P. Hill with 12,000 men to reinforce Jackson, while stepping up artillery bombardments and diversions against McClellan. This caused McClellan to scream for reinforcements again. Halleck finally put him in his place, responding that the fact Lee hadn't already crushed the Army of the Potomac proved that McClellan's assessment was wrong. However, if McClellan actually was as outnumbered as he claimed, all the reinforcements in the Union would accomplish nothing. Lee could easily intercept and destroy them piecemeal. Finally, he was uselessly sitting around in the Virginia bottomlands in July. His army's hospitals were already filled with yellow fever and malaria patients, and it wasn't the height of mosquito season yet. Therefore, unless he advanced by August 4th, McClellan was ordered to evacuate Virginia and return to Washington, D.C. before moving to support Pope's advance. Stung by the rebuke, McClellan petulantly didn't follow his orders until August 14th. Pope didn't wait for McClellan, and on July 29th ordered his vanguard to march for Cedar Mountain and establish a base to raid the Virginia Central Railway. Confederate cavalry alerted Jackson to the move, and he advanced on Culpeper Courthouse, intending to defeat Pope's corps in detail as he'd done in Shenandoah. However, the July heat slowed his advance. Worse, Jackson never told his division commanders their objective or to hurry their march. Consequently, Union cavalry discovered Jackson's position and warned Pope, who ordered his leading corps commander, Nathaniel Banks, to move to defensive positions and await reinforcements. Banks had been repeatedly victimized by Jackson during the Valley Campaign and knew that giving Jackson the initiative was suicidal. Despite being outnumbered 2-1, Banks refused his orders and moved forward to ambush Jackson, looking for revenge. At noon on August 9th, Jackson's vanguard under Jubal Early discovered Federal artillery and cavalry on a ridge above the Cedar Run crossings. Early pulled back and deployed on the right of the field, while additional forces moved up the road to form the left flank. The 98-degree Fahrenheit heat made their movement sluggish, and there were still gaps in the line when an artillery duel commenced at 15:30. Federal fire made Confederate disorganization worse, until the leftmost division's general was mortally wounded, and whose replacement had never been told the battle plan. At that moment, Banks's infantry moved from cover behind the ridge, and charged the Confederate line. Early's troops were pushed back but held together. But the left disintegrated as Union troops charged through gaps in its line and began to attack artillery in the rear. At that moment, Jackson arrived with reinforcements and rallied his fleeing Valley veterans. He swiftly organized an overwhelming counterattack that shattered Banks's corps. Only nightfall and approaching reinforcements stopped Jackson's pursuit. Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross, would tend to the battlefield wounded for the first time after this battle. Jackson held position, expecting additional Union attacks. However, Halleck had ordered Pope to await reinforcements from McClellan near Culpeper. On August 12th, Jackson fell back on Gordonsville. Lee dispatched Longstreet north on the 13th, and after seeing McClellan leaving the peninsula, brought the remaining troops to Gordonsville, reuniting the army. He planned a turning movement against Pope, using Stuart's cavalry to destroy railway bridges and isolate him before crushing the army. However, Federal cavalry captured a dispatch rider carrying the plan and alerted Pope, who withdrew to Rappahannock. Stuart in turn captured Union dispatches showing that Pope had already been reinforced to 77,000 men, which would be expanded to 130,000 by September. Lee needed to strike swiftly, but the flooding Rappahannock limited operations to ineffective skirmishes near the crossings. Finally, on August 25th, Lee opted for an audacious plan proposed by Jackson. He and Stuart would flank Pope's right using the Blue Ridge Mountains to hide his movement, and cut Pope's communication line, the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. This would force Pope to move, during which Jackson could pin him while Lee and Longstreet flanked and crushed the army. Dividing the army in the face of superior numbers flew in the face of all military logic and doctrine, but Lee trusted Jackson. Jackson began the march that night. After slipping through the thoroughfare gap unnoticed, he cut the railroad at Briscoe Station before continuing on to Manassas Junction, Pope's supply base, destroying everything his men couldn't eat or carry off. Next, they pushed across Bull Run Bridge, routing the defenders before reaching the first Bull Run battlefield. Pope ordered Joseph Hooker to intercept Jackson, but Hooker was blocked by Richard Ewell at Kettle Creek Run. That night, Jackson secretly entrenched behind an unfinished railbed near Stony Ridge to await developments. By August 28th, Pope had lost track of Jackson and seemingly forgot that Lee was still out there. After his cavalry failed to locate Jackson, infantry columns were dispatched to search. Realizing that Pope was setting himself up for a crushing flank attack, Jackson attacked a column near Brawner's Farm at 1830 to keep Pope from wandering away. The attack went poorly, and Jackson was pushed back after suffering as many casualties as he inflicted. However, the strategic goal was achieved. Wrongly believing Jackson was retreating from Centerville when the infantry had caught up to him, Pope ordered his army to turn, surround, and capture the isolated Jackson. However, Jackson wasn't in the positions Pope thought he was, and his own troops weren't where he thought they were. Worse, he still believed, against evidence, that Longstreet was in Gordonville. In reality, Longstreet had pushed through the cavalry screen guarding the thoroughfare gap and was preparing to close the trap. It's not clear why Pope didn't know this. At dawn on the 29th, Jackson dispatched Stuart to guide Longstreet's forces into position to ambush Pope. While he waited, Jackson noticed Federal troops preparing to attack and redistributed his forces to hold the railbed until Longstreet was ready. John Buford's cavalry discovered Longstreet's movement at 0815, but Pope wasn't told until 1900. Meanwhile, Pope was discovering that his complacent attack wasn't happening, thanks to his misinformed and confusingly written orders. The Green First Corps was in position, but only by pure coincidence. The rest of his forces either hadn't received orders or were trying to make sense of the impossible movements they'd been assigned. Rather than adjust, he berated his officers and ordered them to get into position without clarifying what positions and where. The First Corps still attacked as ordered, but since Jackson wasn't where Pope thought, its intended flanking attack became a series of bloody and ineffective frontal charges against prepared positions. However, General Sigel believed his objective was just holding Jackson in place and continued his attack. Pope arrived at 1300 to discover that planned reinforcements hadn't arrived and Sigel wasn't fighting the battle Pope wanted. He decided to bring up fresh troops and assault Jackson's center. He also thought he ordered Fitzjohn Porter and Irvin McDowell to attack the right, but in reality his message confusingly suggested they either advance on Gainesville or hold position. Perplexed at discovering unexpected rebels to his front, Porter halted the column. This was actually fortunate for the Union. Longstreet was in position to close the trap by 1200, just waiting for Pope to fully commit against Jackson. However, Stuart spotted Porter near Dawkins Branch and warned Longstreet that his nemesis from the peninsula could turn his flank. As a result, Longstreet held the attack, convincing Lee to wait for a better opportunity. Union forces continued to hammer Jackson until nightfall, pushing back his left flank. This withdrawal reinforced Pope's belief that Jackson was retreating, and Buford's late arriving report made him believe that Longstreet was coming late to relieve Jackson. Needing to finish Jackson before that happened, Porter was finally explicitly ordered to attack Jackson's right, once the rest of the army engaged the left and center. During the night, Longstreet's final division arrived, and in confusion moved too close to the Federal position. Realizing the mistake on the dawn of August 30th, they withdrew, which reinforced Pope's delusion that Jackson was retreating. Refusing to let him go, and against the advice of his generals, Pope ordered more attacks. Jackson was nearly overwhelmed as his men ran out of ammunition as Porter advanced to finish the job. This was what Lee had waited for, and Longstreet's troops attacked. However, the Union Army's loose formation accidentally saved it. 2 brigades were near Longstreet's position awaiting orders. These units raised the alarm and bought enough time for Porter and McDowell to turn and meet the attack. As word spread, individual commanders began moving to defensive positions independently of Pope.
Isn't it funny how all the strategy in the world can be thwarted by accidents? You know, those units right there being too far out, being too far forward, I'll say, caught them before they could really ambush the rest of the line. History's filled with those types of things. Happy accidents that save people or that prevent things from happening. It's just crazy.
Who still believed he only faced Jackson. Longstreet surged forward and Jackson joined the attack at 1800, but the Federal positions on Henry Hill held. Stuart attempted to swing around the flank for a rear attack, but was driven back by Buford. During the night, Pope withdrew to Centerville before continuing to Washington. Jackson attempted to cut him off at Chantilly, but the rearguard held, and Pope successfully linked up with McClellan. Lee had won a great victory, and his men knew it. They'd convincingly beaten a superior army, inflicting 14,500 casualties at the price of 7,300. From this victory came the elan and morale that made the Army of Northern Virginia legendary. However, it wasn't the victory Lee needed. Pope was humiliated and his army crippled, but it had escaped intact. This was a major tactical victory, but it wasn't a Saratoga-level strategic victory. He needed something more. Though Pope's army was safely within Washington's defenses, Pope was besieged. He court-martialed Porter as a scapegoat, but it was clear his arrogance and ineptitude disqualified him from frontline command. Instead, he was reassigned to fight the Dakota War. This derailed Lincoln's plan to rid himself of McClellan, with plausible deniability, by folding his army into Pope's. Instead, McClellan would reabsorb the Army of Virginia. His cabinet objected to giving McClellan another chance, but as Lincoln explained, "We must use what tools we have. There is no man in the army who can man these fortifications and lick these troops of ours into shape half as well as he. If he can't fight himself, he excels in making others ready to fight." Testifying to McClellan's abilities, the army was reorganized and ready for its bloodiest test a week after Second Bull Run. Following First Bull Run, Joseph Johnston had contemplated but rejected an offensive against the North. Doing so would severely undermine Confederate diplomacy, claiming they were acting in self-defense. More importantly, there was no viable target. Washington was rapidly becoming the most fortified city in the world, which protected Baltimore by proximity. Marching on Philadelphia was insanely risky, and no other reachable cities would deal a knockout blow to Northern morale. Thus, he'd remained in Virginia. However, Lee concluded by September 3rd that remaining in Virginia wasn't viable. While Pope's depredation campaign had done significant damage to northern Virginia, it was nothing compared to the normal damage armies caused on the campaign. From Shenandoah to the sea, Virginia was devastated and couldn't supply his army. Leaving Virginia was the only way to feed his increasingly barefoot and hungry army, and the only viable justification for leaving was a northern invasion. Lee's primary goal was to reach Pennsylvania's rich farmland and feed his troops. His secondary objective was to cut the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, a major lifeline for both Washington and Baltimore. Lee believed threatening a major city might cost the Republicans their congressional majority that November. After recalling part of the Richmond garrison to replenish his army to 55,000, Lee informed Davis of his plans and started north, dispatching Jackson to take Harper's Ferry to secure their supply route and hopefully capture extensive military stores. Lee's vanguard crossed into Maryland on September 4th. By pure coincidence, another invasion was underway in Kentucky, led by Edmund Kirby Smith and Braxton Bragg. Jefferson Davis sent each general proclamations to distribute, explaining that they weren't a conquering force and were simply trying to aggressively end the war. The action was superfluous, as each general had already done so. Lee added that he was a liberator and invited Marylanders to join him. He received no takers. Western Maryland was firmly anti-slavery, and most of the Chesapeake region slaveholders were in prison or had already fled southward.
You can't blame him for trying. Hey, listen, guys, we could use your help. You want to support us, and you want to end the war too, right? Well, yeah, you can't fault him for that.
Around 10,000 soldiers fell out of the march. Several units refused to cross the Potomac, as they'd explicitly enlisted only to defend the South. Many suffered diarrhea after eating unripe corn, and many others simply couldn't continue after cutting their bare feet on the stony northern roads. Meanwhile, first panic, then resolution spread through Maryland and Pennsylvania as Lee approached. Both states called out their militia, while cities prepared to withstand sieges. McClellan was busily reincorporating Pope's former army, while trying to regain his former job from Halleck, when news of Lee's movement reached Washington. Lincoln ordered a pursuit, but again McClellan claimed, without evidence, that Lee had 120,000 men that his 107,000 couldn't hope to match. Knowing that Lee couldn't possibly have more than 70,000, Lincoln kicked McClellan into motion with 87,000 men on September 7th. The reception frightened Marylanders gave the army boosted morale, but their marching speed was glacial. McClellan finally reached Frederick early on September 13th, where Corporal Barton Mitchell discovered Lee's invasion plans wrapped around 3 cigars. Upon receiving the intelligence, McClellan exclaimed, "Now I know what to do." He then boastfully wired Lincoln that he had Lee bagged and would send trophies, before doing absolutely nothing with the intelligence for 18 hours. McClellan finally gave orders to advance on Lee through South Mountain that night. Lee learned through unknown means that his plans were discovered, and McClellan was closing in. Realizing the danger, he urgently recalled Jackson and sent reinforcements to hold South Mountain until Jackson arrived. They were insufficient, and Federal troops easily took Crampton's Gap. The defenders of Fox and Turner's Gaps put up a strong fight, but superior numbers let the Federals push through. Lee withdrew, the first time that had happened for the Army of the Potomac, boosting morale. Rather than pursue the disorganized rebels, McClellan again halted to reorganize. Lee used the time to concentrate and coordinate his troops to make a stand near Sharpsburg. Meanwhile, Jackson had surrounded 14,000 new Union recruits in Harper's Ferry, first driving them off Maryland Heights on September 13th and then surrounding the town. As it surrendered on September 15th, Jackson received word from Lee to march for Sharpsburg. Leaving AP Hill to finish securing captured supplies and paroled prisoners, Jackson marched out and reached Lee the next day. McClellan finally reached Lee's position early September 16th, finding him strung out along the low ridge behind Antietam Creek. McClellan was still convinced that Lee had at least 100,000 soldiers, despite the captured plans clearly showing he'd started with 55,000 total. Lee currently had only 18,000 troops to face McClellan's entire army, but despite pressure, McClellan refused to attack immediately. This allowed Longstreet to arrive from Hagerstown and Jackson from Harper's Ferry, increasing Lee's force to 37,000. After positioning his troops, McClellan issued written orders to his corps commanders to advance the next day, and then went to bed. He never held a council of war or actually explained the battle plan. Based on what happened, historians believe he intended an echelon attack, drawing Lee's forces to the left flank with heavy assaults, before rolling up the right flank. However, McClellan wouldn't arrive on the battlefield until 1300 and never realized nobody understood the plan. At 0530, Joseph Hooker's First Corps advanced towards Dunkard Church. An artillery duel began as his men left the North Wood and entered Miller's Cornfield, where they found Jackson's concealed rebels. A bloody, uncoordinated brawl ensued as units lost each other in the cornstalks and orders went unheard over cannon fire. However, Hooker's Iron Brigade pushed through the West Wood, repelling counterattacks, and Jackson's line neared collapse. Confederate reinforcements arrived at 0700 and drove Hooker back with a savage counterattack. Just then, Joseph Mansfield's 12th Corps arrived, attacking in deep columns to keep its raw recruits from bolting. Mansfield was mortally wounded as his 2nd Division broke through West Wood, chasing off batteries near Dunkard Church. Hooker was wounded trying to re-establish command. Sedgwick's division from Sumner's 2nd Corps arrived to turn the rebel flank in Eastwood, but by 0945 the attack was driven off with heavy casualties. By this time, the rest of the 2nd Corps was assaulting Lee's center, anchored along a sunken road beneath the ridge. Despite successfully holding off multiple attacks, the constant pressure forced Lee to deploy his last reserves at 10:30. As Southern officers fell, the defense became confused, and Caldwell's New York Brigade discovered a weak point. Breaking through, they turned enfilade fire down the road, remembered as Bloody Lane, to devastating effect. As Confederates fell back, Longstreet assembled a grand battery that slowed the Union advance, so a counterattack could halt it. Had McClellan put in the 5th and 6th Corps, the line may have broken, but instead he arrived and halted the northern attacks at 1300. To the south, Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps was supposed to demonstrate to draw Lee's attention from Hooker before crossing Antietam Creek to attack the Confederate right, but only once explicitly ordered. Those orders didn't arrive until 1000. By that time, his 12,500 troops faced no more than 3,000 Confederates, as Lee redeployed against the northern attacks. However, not knowing his actual role, and thinking he only had to cross the creek, Burnside took his time and didn't make it across until 1300, taking far more casualties than the defenders. Here, Burnside stalled again for 2 hours to replenish his ammunition. His attack finally commenced at 1500, and the rebel line began to collapse and flee into Sharpsburg. However, at 1530, A.P. Hill arrived and attacked Burnside's left, which crumbled. When Burnside requested reinforcements, McClellan told him only 1 battery was available, rather than the 2 corps he was keeping in reserve for the massive counterattack he expected from Lee's imaginary reserves. Fighting ceased at 1730, but the Battle of Antietam had been the bloodiest single day in American military history. McClellan had suffered 12,410 casualties, 25% of his army. Lee suffered 10,316 casualties, 31% of his army. Clara Barton brought medical supplies and spent weeks treating the wounded. That night, Lee slipped back across the Potomac. Other than a half-hearted attempt by Porter's 5th Corps at Shepherdstown, McClellan didn't pursue, despite explicit orders from the War Department. This was the final straw for Lincoln. Despite holding every material and informational advantage a general could ask for, the best McClellan could do was slightly push Lee back. McClellan was relieved of command on November 5th, ending his military career. In our next video on the American Civil War, Lincoln will find new generals but get the same results. To make sure you don't miss that.
Okay. Brutal. In 21, I came from Norfolk up to, I went back to Mount Vernon and Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg? Yeah. Fredericksburg. So it's not really important. Just a side note. Yeah. So like Mount Vernon's, I don't know, somewhere around here. Alexandria is north of it, so I'd say it's somewhere around here maybe. But on my way up, I wanted to Chancellorsville, I believe, is where. Isn't that where Jackson wounded and died in a church or a home or something in Chancellorsville, I believe? And Fredericksburg is the Angel of Fredericksburg. It's an Angel of Marion Heights or whatever. But I wanted to see both those, but I had one day, and I wanted to go up to Mount Vernon. But I stopped at Fredericksburg and ate at a Waffle House. Completely unrelated to this entire story. But I was there. I was in the thick of it in a Waffle House in Fredericksburg. So kept seeing the signs for Chancellorsville, and I was like, oh, man, I really wanted to go there. I thought about hitting it on the way back, but I stayed at Mount Vernon until like 5 o'clock, and I had a 2-hour drive back or something. So I was like, no. And I was leaving early the next morning, so sometimes you have to pass things for other things. And I'm phasing again. I'm traveling. And I'm back. And the very first time I saw this, I thought it said Amishville. Because that's what happens when you quickly look at something and your brain puts words together. So I'm just going to go ahead and end it here. But I'll be back. I'll continue to cover their series as long as they're making them. All right, so until next time, have a good day, have a good night.